Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Fort Monroe on this Independence Day, the 4th of July. And welcome to Fort Monroe on behalf of the superintendent and the park and all of those that feel very strongly and support Fort Monroe for all these many years. Welcome to you being here. I see old faces, new faces, friendly faces, and those that we maybe get to know even more. And thank you very much for coming here. This is an annual event we have on the occasion of the anniversary of the death of President James Monroe, and recognizing many other elements that may contribute to that person's life and service, and this particular fortification named after the president. And we welcome you all be here on this occasion to talk about and explore more about his legacy, the fort's experience and history and legacy. And if you keep coming back with us, you will hear many different themes and topics over the years. With that being said, if I could get you to all be upstanding, we're going to take this occasion to lower the flag in recognition of his death. So if we would render the appropriate honors, we very much appreciate that. You may be seated. We'd like to welcome our first speaker from the American Friends of Lafayette, Robert Kelly.
Well, good morning. It is an honor and pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to my friend Mark Walsh and his remarks, which will give you, I think, a flavor more specifically about Monroe and Lafayette and its connections to this place. I want to chat with you all a little bit about Lafayette specifically. Perhaps now more than ever, we look to figures from the past to give us inspiration and wisdom as we continue to grapple with the ideals of freedom and liberty and what they mean in our country today. As Vice President of the American Friends of Lafayette, I'm one of over 1,100 members who believe that his story is vital for all Americans to hear, and that his legacy inspires us to become better citizens. I would like to take a few minutes to explore Lafayette's connections to Fort Monroe as we gather here to celebrate our nation's birthday and to honor the friendship between President Monroe and General Lafayette. Lafayette, the 19-year-old French aristocrat who purchased his own ship and traveled to America to volunteer in the Continental Army, being wounded at the Battle of Brandywine while leading American troops. The 24-year-old who was on the field at Yorktown and had earned the reputation of being a fearless leader and one of George Washington's most trusted officers and adopted son. The boy general who helped forge a critical alliance between France and the United States. The man who supported and advocated democracy and openly challenged America's founding fathers on tough topics such as slavery. 20th century Lafayette biographer Martha Foote Crowe encapsulated his career succinctly as the boy Cornwallis could not catch, the man Napoleon could not intimidate. Fast forward in antiquity when Lafayette is 67 years old and the Continental Army's last living general. At the invitation of President James Monroe, Lafayette arrived in America as guest of the nation in 1824. Lafayette's return to America lasted 13 months, during which time he visited all 24 states, traveled 6,000 miles, and was welcomed by the cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. He was hosted by former presidents, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and by current presidents at the time, James Monroe and later John Quincy Adams, and even by future President Andrew Jackson. He was accompanied by his only son, 45-year-old George Washington Lafayette, his secretary, Auguste Levasseur, and his personal servant. Treated with immense admiration and respect everywhere he visited, lavish parties, cotillions, concerts, parades, and speeches were a regular occurrence that celebrated his heroism, fame, legacy, and connection to George Washington. During the 43 years between the surrender at Yorktown and Lafayette's final return to America, he had managed to stay in close contact with the Founding Fathers, exchanging dozens of letters with the likes of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and Monroe. Lafayette's influence and engagement with American politics continued through the early 19th century and even became critically important to the development of the third system of American fortifications, of which Fort Monroe is the largest. In fact, it is the largest masonry fort in all of North America. Lafayette's direct connections to this place run through another Frenchman, whom you may be less familiar with, General Simon Bernard, the engineer responsible for this fort's design. Bernard was born in Dole, France in 1779. He graduated second in his class from École Polytechnique, which remains one of the most prestigious science and engineering schools in France. He then entered the Engineer Corps of the French Army in 1797. He was immediately engaged in military conflict and was even wounded several times. His bravery under fire was recognized by Napoleon himself. Bernard's early accomplishments would include the design of the fortifications of Antwerp, Belgium in 1809, and the distinction of becoming Napoleon's aide-de-camp in 1813. Remaining loyal to Napoleon until the end, the 36-year-old Bernard was with the emperor at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Following Napoleon's abdication, Bernard was banished from public life in France, but was soon to find lasting fame here in America. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the War of 1812 had exposed America's lack of coastal defenses when the British fleet sailed past Old Point Comfort and up the Chesapeake Bay. They burned Washington, D.C. President Madison desired an experienced military engineer to lead the fortifications project that would protect America's shores from future enemy attack. Madison wrote to our friend Lafayette, seeking assistance and suggestions. General Lafayette replied on November 11, 1815, and recommended that he employ Simon Bernard to oversee the construction and design of coastal defenses in the United States. Lafayette conveyed that, quote, General Bernard has so eminently distinguished himself in the Corps of Engineers, namely in the fortifications of Antwerp, that the Emperor Napoleon made him his aide-de-camp. In that capacity, he obtained more and more the respect and affection of all. 1 year later, Bernard was appointed assistant engineer with the rank and pay of U.S. Army Brigadier General. He arrived in America and was placed at the head of a board of engineers charged with the construction of coastal defenses, forts, roads, and canals. Fort Monroe, however, was Bernard's true masterpiece, and it has often been called the Gibraltar of the Chesapeake. So back to the topic of today, Lafayette's connection to Fort Monroe and James Monroe. Wouldn't it make sense that Lafayette would desire to visit Fort Monroe, the fort designed by his colleague and the engineer he recommended to the President, Madison? Well, of course. On Sunday afternoon, October 24th, 1824, Lafayette arrived here, where he was received with the highest military honors. The general was escorted throughout Fort Monroe by Colonel Abraham Eustis. That should be a name familiar to you all. Fort Eustis is right up the road here. Who was the commanding officer at the time. Later in the evening, Colonel Eustis received Lafayette at his quarters, where he partook of a handsome cotillion party and spent the evening. The next morning, he received the troops on the parade field and the officers of Fort Monroe. After taking breakfast with Colonel Eustis, he visited the adjacent fortifications of Castle Calhoun, known today as Fort Wool, just about a mile that way. Beginning on August 16th, 2024, just in a few months, and continuing for 13 months, the American Friends of Lafayette will be commemorating the bicentennial of Lafayette's return to America as guest of the nation. We will be hosting 250 educational programs across the 24 states that Lafayette visited. Our goal is to have the events on the actual bicentennial day in the actual place. For example, we will be commemorating Lafayette's visit here on Thursday, October 24th, 2024, with the Living History Dining Experience at the Historic Chamberlain. Other program locations include the White House, U.S. Capitol, Embassy of France, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and even St. Louis. In Virginia, he traveled as far west as St. Louis in 1825, actually. In Virginia, we'll be hosting programming at Monticello, Montpelier, UVA, and in Norfolk, Suffolk, Williamsburg, Yorktown, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and across Northern Virginia. Some have asked, why is it important to commemorate this bicentennial? Why is it so important? I think this question may be addressed by looking at the relevancy of the history and the connections between 1824 and today. There are many. In 1824, the United States was in the throes of a very contentious national presidential election. Sound familiar? That one was won by John Quincy Adams. Our country was divided and in turmoil. At this time, President Monroe thought if he invited Lafayette, the last surviving major general of the American Revolution, it might foster unity and renew patriotism among our citizens, especially as the nation approached the 50th anniversary of its independence. At the time, many U.S. citizens knew that Lafayette had been involved in other revolutions in Europe and in South America, and had been in prison for over 5 years as a result of the French Revolution. During and after the American Revolution, Lafayette strongly supported Enlightenment principles, human rights for all, religious freedom, Native American rights, equality for women, freedom of the press, and penal reform. He was a leading abolitionist of his time and always fought for liberty, equality, and freedom. Today in our nation, much like in 1824, we are facing a tough election. We are approaching a milestone anniversary of independence, 250 years, and we continue to wrestle with human rights, freedom, equality, refugees, religious tolerance. These are words and issues that we regularly hear discussed and debated. Now more than ever, we need to know our history and teach our history, our full history. Now more than ever, we need Lafayette, someone whose legacy and philosophy inspires us to be better, to be welcoming, inclusive, civil, to once again strive for equality and freedom for all people. These are the reasons that Lafayette and this bicentennial are important. In closing, it is my hope that something I've shared today may inspire you to research more about Lafayette, President Monroe, or this important place, Fort Monroe. I'm also hopeful that you might consider attending one of our Lafayette bicentennial events. To learn more about our programming, please visit our website, lafayette200.org. I'm grateful to the National Park Service, and especially Mark Walsh and the James Monroe Foundation for this opportunity to address you today. Until we chat again, I will leave you with this. At a civic dinner in Portsmouth, Virginia, to honor Lafayette in 1824, Dr. Robert Archer offered the following toast: patriotism and philanthropy. When combined in the same individual, he may be justly styled the noblest work of God. 8 years later, Dr. Archer became the head surgeon right here at Fort Monroe. Have a very happy and safe 4th of July. Thank you.
Well, to explore more the relationship between Lafayette and Monroe, I'd like to welcome and invite our good friend Mark Walsh from the James Monroe Memorial Foundation, with whom this particular program may not have happened so fully and so well. So I thank you very much for your efforts for all these years and for the foundation partnership. Please.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron is being very kind. It has been our partnership, the two of us working on this, that has brought it forward and made it as successful as it is. Thank you very much. Now, talking about what I call freedom's friendship, Monroe and Lafayette. Before I do that, let me introduce to you two members of the National Advisory Board from the James Monroe Foundation, Mr. Shelby Chandler from Fredericksburg, Mr. Jay Wright from Portsmouth. We're going to talk a lot about Monroe and Lafayette as comrades at arms, as brother Masons, and as fellow abolitionists. As it happens, this is not a necessary thing, it's just as it happens, all three of us are Masons. As it happens, our brother Chandler there is a past master of the home lodge of James Monroe, Fredericksburg Lodge number 4. As it happens, Brother Wright is a Mason in both Portsmouth and Norfolk, and Portsmouth was one of the lodges that Lafayette visited when he was here. I am a Norfolk Mason, and if you go to Norfolk Lodge number 1, into their visitors register, you will see the signatures of Lafayette, James Washington Lafayette, and Vasseur, the aide-de-camp that was with them when they came to attend lodge there. So these things are all intermingled and intermixed, and we're going to go over those things in terms of their relationship together. Brandywine, 1777. It's likely there that James Monroe and Gilbert de Motier, better known as Lafayette, met for the first time. Monroe had been wounded at Trenton when he and his troops overtook a cannon and wrestled it away from the Hessians. That took him off the active field. He became the aide-de-camp to General Lord Stirling, who was a Scottish noble, but a devoted American patriot. At Brandywine, as Robert indicated, General Lafayette was wounded in the leg. Now, Monroe had a rudimentary knowledge of French. Lafayette could speak English just fine. But the thought was, if we could send someone with him who could speak French, if in his pain he wanted to talk his own native language, we should enable him to do that, which they did. The start of the friendship is right there. I mean, imagine that if you're in as much as Lafayette loved the United States, he still had a mother tongue that was different than ours. And there was someone who could help him to talk and communicate if he needed it. So that's the start of their friendship right there. Now, things go through. The revolution continues. It did not end, by the way, at Yorktown. That's a misnomer. There's a lot of activity in the West. There's a lot of different battles go on, but in the main, the British backbone has been broken. And Lafayette has an incredibly important role in that. And Monroe was not jealous or anything like that, but he really wanted to be part of that and couldn't because of his wound in the way that would be meaningful. But he did ride back and forth from General Lord Stirling, carrying orders to his officers, talking to people, making sure reports were done. And by the way, the winter of 1777, 1778 in Valley Forge, General Lord Stirling's house was a stone's throw away from Lafayette's house. So in that very difficult winter, the two of them were together and had more time to speak French together, more time to get to know each other better, and to spend time and talk. As Robert mentioned, Lafayette was 19 years old when the war broke out. Monroe was 18. So imagine the closeness in age, the closeness in temperament, the language commonality, and all these things are making these two young men very close together. Okay? Now, the thing that struck them both from the Constitution, from the Declaration of Independence, was the words, "All men are created equal." Monroe increasingly had difficulty with those words because here in Virginia, obviously, all men were not created equal because of the institution of slavery. Now, Lafayette takes those words and uses them in his first draft of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which he does not finish, but this is very important to him. It inspires him. And more in Monroe's life, those words will inspire him as well. I believe it's 1785, he purchases some property in French Guiana, Lafayette that is, and he has a workforce there that are enslaved, that come with a plantation. He's growing cinnamon and cloves. He frees his workforce and pays them a wage and still makes a profit, thereby undermining the notion that's very prevalent in the South that you have to have slavery in order to make the economy work. Lafayette shows, no, you don't. And believe me, Monroe takes notice. So we keep going here until Monroe is now minister to France in the 1790s. And at that point, Lafayette has been arrested in Austria and is being held in prison because, of course, Napoleon had control of Europe. Family members in on different thrones, running different countries. It is really the French Empire writ large. It's the old, Roman Empire, except now it's French in so many different ways. So there is Lafayette in prison, unable to stop the things that are happening to his family back in France. His mother-in-law and his wife are arrested and put in the Bastille. His mother-in-law is executed by the guillotine. Terrible way to die. Okay, James Monroe and Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe are in Paris at that time. They come up with an opportunity to save Marie Adrienne Lafayette's life. Elizabeth Courtwright is a beautiful woman, very beautiful. Goes down to the Bastille, overwhelms the guards with her charm and her beauty, and says, "Why is this woman here?" And they look at her, "Well, because she's an aristocrat." "No, she's an American citizen," because the Lafayettes have been given citizenship of our country for his work in the revolution. Well, the guards talk amongst themselves and talk to the officers that are there. "No, they cannot do this. They don't want a war with the United States. They can't afford that. If this is an American citizen, they must set her free. And they do. So to all of the gentlemen here today who have either wives or girlfriends, imagine what this would be like if your wife was just set free days before she was going to have her head chopped off. How would you feel about that friend? How close would you be to that person? Well, they were very close, closer than ever. Now, fast forward to 1802. Monroe is no longer the Minister of France because he is so pro-French, so much a Francophile, that Washington is afraid that he will take French concerns over American concerns in his work as the ambassador there. So he recalls him. Jefferson, when he becomes president, understands that Monroe has a unique understanding of the French, and there's a very good reason for that. Not only now he doesn't have the rudimentary knowledge of French anymore. He's fluently bilingual now, after being ambassador. He and his wife and children speak French in their home. They don't speak English, they speak French. So in 1802, he and Robert Livingston, another Mason, by the way, are sent over to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, which they do. He sees Lafayette at that time. This is the first time they've seen each other in some time. Reunion of the old friends. This is a marvelous thing. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase is completed. Now, this is something that happens because Napoleon decides to throw so much more of the land in than we ever expected. And he doubles the size of the continental United States at that point. But most people are aware of the fact that Lafayette and Napoleon do not get along. Even given this fact that they don't get along, Jefferson offers Lafayette the governorship of Louisiana in 1803, which he declines, and offers him some property, which I think he did accept. But the point is, they dared to poke Napoleon in the eye over this appointment because that's how important Lafayette was to them, to both Jefferson and Monroe. So, fortunately, that didn't happen that way. Louisiana came to us, everything was fine. Napoleon didn't get upset, and there we go. Okay. There's not a whole lot known about what went on between Monroe and Lafayette between 1802 and 1824. There's a lot of different reasons for that. If one Mason says to another that you're being told something in confidence, they are obliged not to pass it on to anybody. If that shows up in your correspondence, you're more likely to destroy it than to keep it for posterity. So we don't know exactly what happened. More research is required. We can probably find some things, but they were still tight, close friends. So Monroe says to Congress, you know, he is the last, knowing that he's going through a tough time, that Lafayette's going through a tough time, he is the last living general. We really should bring him back here. You know, things are getting to a point where we're going to have to remind people of why we're doing all this for the 50th anniversary. Because remember, what happened was when Monroe was elected to his second term in office, the two-party system that had been there, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, broke down. The Federalist Party really went to ground. So there isn't the same two-party system. Therefore, there's a lot of chaos at the end of his second term because there's no party structure in place to put candidates forward the way there had been before. Now, John Quincy Adams is a holdover from the Federalists. His father was one. So he eventually does become the next president, but as Robert was pointing out, the election of 1824 is quite a raucous event. So, in order to do this and look after things, Congress comes back to Monroe, likes his idea, says, yes, would you please invite your friend, Lafayette, to come and visit us, all expenses paid, which is what is done. Now, locally, he comes here, he goes to Portsmouth, he goes to Norfolk. So you will find, as I said, the signature of Lafayette, his son, and his aide-de-camp in Norfolk number 1. I suspect you'd probably find them in Fredericksburg number 4. And you might find them in Portsmouth 100 as well. I don't know for sure. You'd have to find out and check that out. So I'm being told, yes, you will. The fact of the matter is, the Masonic part of his life plays an important role. His brother, that way, Brother James Monroe, has never been a master of a lodge. He doesn't have time for that. He's a president. Washington was. He was the president of what's now known as Washington Alexandria, Lodge number 22, up in Northern Virginia. But point is, they are going together in this Masonic journey, which teaches them that that every human being has a claim upon their good offices. We as Masons are told that every time we go to a meeting. So we go back to the idea, all men are created equal. And Lafayette spends a great deal of time in his visit to Monticello and Montpelier talking to both Jefferson and Madison about this very fact and how slavery must end. We can rest assured that these two brothers who could talk confidentially and say whatever they wanted to each other without fear of it being passed on to anybody else had these conversations. And what I want to tell you about in particular, the best indication of what Lafayette did with Monroe is after Monroe was president in 1829, and I've spoken about this here before. In 1829, there was a state constitutional convention, not the federal constitution, our state constitution. Monroe is the best known Virginian at that time, so they asked him to chair it. As the chair, he cannot introduce resolutions, but he can make recommendations. He makes a recommendation at that constitutional convention that every enslaved man, woman, and child in Virginia be emancipated immediately, put on ships paid for by the federal government, and sent to Liberia, which has been established in Africa. How much more do you have to say to declare yourself to be an abolitionist than to say emancipation must take place? He knows that he does not have the wherewithal to have the whole country do this, so he says, let's start with my home state. And let's start with this constitutional convention. Let's put it in our Constitution that we do not believe in slavery. This is only 4 years after Lafayette's visit. So obviously he's been ruminating about this and thinking about this. He takes a big risk because he is of the planter class. He owns slaves himself or had owned slaves. You ever wonder to yourself, why don't we know more about James Monroe? Why isn't more said about him? Why am I, as a Canadian expatriate and naturalized American citizen, on the National Advisory Board? If this was the George Washington Memorial Foundation, I wouldn't have a hope of getting on there. But here I am. So, I do believe that there were people who actively took offense at what he did and probably tried to destroy his legacy and his memory. However, we're here today to make sure that doesn't happen. And we remember people like Monroe and Lafayette and the courage that they had to live by those sayings, all men are created equal, to push for that to happen and to ensure the freedom of every enslaved man, woman, and child. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Mark. And we thank all of you very much for coming here today to observe the anniversary of Monroe's death, to explore a little bit more this relationship that, as has just been described, grew out of patriotism and war and conflict, but thrived throughout the rest of their life and established this relationship that has created so many other opportunities and moments in their own lives, but as the development of the nation itself, and certainly fitting then on this Independence Day to recognize and take that moment to do so. So thank you both, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Walsh, for joining us here today. And again, thank you all for joining us in this instance and the continued support with the James Monroe Memorial Foundation. We intend to be right back here again 365 days from today. I've taken all your faces and names. I look forward to seeing you here, there. Bring someone along with you. We'd love to continue to have this thrive and grow. Before we exit and depart to whatever the rest of our Independence Day celebrations may bring each of you and those around the nation and the globe who may find themselves other places serving the United States or serving their own interests. Please do take your own time and your own way to recognize what it is for you for today, which could be very different for each and every one of us. This is also sort of the beginnings of the ramping up towards the 250th of the United States foundations, as it were. And it is important to note that it is not just about the classic traditional sort of ideas of patriotism and nationalism and the United States establishment, that it means something different for each of us for our own purposes. In many ways, as we recall from our civics lessons, this is a nation, a melting pot of our establishment, welcoming, you're tired, you're tired, you're sick, you're poor masses, yearning to breathe free, and bringing in folks, as Mr. Walsh was mentioning, coming from our good friends and neighbors to the north, and many others around the globe to become their own version of an American dream for themselves. And that is true through all of these tumults and problems, through slavery and religious freedom and political views and economics and all of these things. So, this type of a day may not mean the same for every one of us, and it may have different legacies that become involved. And as we move towards the 250th, we are looking at not just that event and the formation and the independence established at that date for this nation to become its own and chart its own course, but the legacy of what has transpired since, from that day to this, and the arc and the journey that we have taken together, stumbled, risen, fallen, regrouped and recovered, and all of that means. And so it is stories that include the first peoples that were here, all the way through the most recent arrivals and those that may be getting naturalized today somewhere in the United States. And everyone their journeys are unique and valuable and a part of that legacy. So as we all work towards that 250th, please note that we're not just talking about the revolution. We're not just talking about those first 13 colonies. We're really talking about the inclusive we, the people, from then all the way through to now. And with that, thank you very much for coming here. I'd like for you again to all be upstanding. We are going to return the flag back to its full status and then go off with the rest of our day. So with that being said, we will give the appropriate honors.